Good morning, everyone. It is the 9th of May, 2021, and this is our Sunday morning class in the I Ams of John. Here we're going to keep going with our study of the I Ams, these great statements that Jesus makes about his, basically his deity. But while that's a big part of it, it also gives us different aspects of himself and kind of reveals something more about Jesus, right? He's not just a normal human being, he's much more than that. And of course, with any person, it's hard to really capture them in, a digestible way, right? That's why you have all kinds of biographies written about individuals. Because one book, you can't just write one definitive book and that be all of it, right? There are different ways to look at it. There may be different aspects, different things that other biographers don't include. And so in kind of a similar way, I think you see these different angles that the I am statements give us that reflect different parts of Jesus's work. If he couldn't just use one image and really capture everything of who he is and what he did, he uses a number of these things to kind of give us that full picture of who he is and what he does. So last week we talked about Jesus being the sheep gate, right? And that's one of those that isn't quite so easy to interpret in today's society because we don't really have anything equivalent to that, right? We mentioned last week that the sheep very often would be in this enclosure, and there would just be an open space where they would come in and out. And the shepherd would lay across that space at night, keep the sheep in, but also be at the ready just in case, predators were around and all that. So we don't really have any kind of equivalent to that. That's something that has to be explored, right? Well, I guess something that we're a little more familiar with is the fact that Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And that's an image that I think we do understand a little bit better. In John chapter 10, Jesus here says that he's the Good Shepherd. And when he talks about being the sheep gate and the Good Shepherd, they're very close to each other. They're sort of these kind of complementary images, but at the same time they each communicate something that's distinctive. Okay, and now shepherds in the ancient world were incredibly important because they were just sort of a basic cog in the wheel of the ancient economy, right? Because ancient economies in general, when this is especially so in Old Testament times, they were very much agriculturally based, right? They very much had to do with livestock. And so when you talk about, like in the book of Job, about what a rich guy he was, it doesn't say he had all this gold and silver. It says he had this boatload of thousands and thousands of livestock of different kinds. That's where his wealth was, right? I think we've mentioned in here somewhere before that coins, for instance, coins were not minted until about the 6th or 7th century BC, right? And so when we look at Old Testament times, very often wealth was wrapped up in livestock. Well, that means that shepherds were a very, very important part of the ancient world. And we've got all kinds of documents that tell us about the kind of contracts that shepherds would make with livestock owners, right? And so there would, terms of service and, maybe contingencies for if predators came along and maybe snatched one of the sheep or one of the goats or something like that. There'd be some kind of provision made for that. As long as the shepherd did at least some kind of rudimentary attempt to fend off wolves or thieves or something like that. There is a passage in the book of Isaiah that talks about bringing back a piece of an ear or a couple of legs of a sheep. And there it seems to represent the remnant of Israel, but that was part of the contract in the ancient world, was you couldn't just say, oh, well, oops, this sheep got stolen. I tried to prevent it from happening, but, those coyotes, they're sneaky, right? No, you would have to bring back some piece of the sheep, and this is kind of gruesome, but a certain amount of the sheep's carcass to prove that you had made some kind of attempt to defend the flock against predators, right? So it was a very, very important part of the ancient economy, and the Bible also mentions how the hireling is someone who's going to run away, right? Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. I'm the one who gives his life for his sheep. He cares about his sheep," right? And here is you think of references like Psalm 23, where David makes this reference to God in a way that sort of portrays the person or the believer as a sheep, and God is this shepherd who is this great provider, right? He's the defender, the rod and the staff that it talks about in the psalm there. The staff really has more to do with kind of like the shepherd's crook. The rod has to do with the weapon that would be used against predators. If a predator came around, a wolf or something like that, maybe a bear or a lion, right? Something. It would be a weapon that they would use to protect the sheep. So you have provision and protection, kind of all as part of the shepherd's job description. Well, if you look at the imagery that's used of David when he fights Goliath, it is very reminiscent of what you would expect from a shepherd, because when David fights Goliath, and you can go back and look at the text yourself in 1 Samuel, where he talks about 1 Samuel 17, where he mentions Goliath, and he said, "Just as God has delivered me from the hand of the paw of the bear and the lion, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And so it's almost like what he's doing is he's describing Goliath in the same kind of terms that he's used to, the kind of enemy that he's used to handling in his work as a shepherd, right? And so in a sense, he is doing the job that Saul should be doing, right? Saul should be the one who's fighting Goliath. He's the guy who's taller, according to 1 Samuel, he's his head and shoulders taller than everyone else. He's the one who should be out there. Because kings in the ancient world and in ancient Israel were known as shepherds. They were called shepherds, right? So Saul is the shepherd of ancient Israel. He is the one who should be out there fighting the predator, who is Goliath. And David instead stands up and he says, then I'll do it. I fought bears and I fought lions. I grabbed them by their beards. And just as God delivered me from those animals, he'll deliver me from this Philistine animal. Whether they walk on 4 legs or they walk on 2, it doesn't matter to me. And so, in a sense, it's almost like foreshadowing when David will eventually become king of Israel, because in a sense, he's kind of doing Saul's job right there, right? Well, all this kind of has as its backdrop the imagery of the shepherd in ancient Israel, and it really is a pretty marvelous thing. Now, Jesus uses this imagery and applies it to himself, and here Jesus is contrasting the good shepherd and the hireling. Now, the shepherd makes his livelihood by his sheep. The hireling is just hired for a while, and he doesn't care about the sheep. He has no vested interest in the sheep. This is a job. right? This is something that he's hired to do, and he can drop it tomorrow, right? And so at the first sign of trouble, a hireling might be tempted to run, but a good shepherd will defend his sheep and defend it to the death, right? And this is exactly what Jesus does, right? And in a sense, this is almost like kind of, I don't know, maybe in a way foreshadowing the cross, where he makes it clear that he's willing to go to the very end, to the end of the line, to defend his sheep, right? And he does it. He does it at Golgotha. Well, that is something that is Jesus' decision. And again, that's one of those things that he makes very clear. Because, there are places where he says, no one takes my life from me. I voluntarily give. I lay my life down and I'll take it back up again, right? And so he makes it very clear this is his decision. This is not something that he was forced into. This is not something that he dies at the whim of Roman authorities. He lays down his life voluntarily for his sheep because he has a vested interest in his sheep, just like a good shepherd has in his flock. He's not a hireling. A hireling would drop his stuff and run at the first sign of trouble. That is not what Jesus does. Now, what is really fascinating about Jesus' imagery here is, in John chapter 10, is that he actually includes one line. And I think that it could be tempting to just kind of read over it and maybe not capture exactly what it is Jesus is saying here. But if you notice in John chapter 10, verse 16, this is what he says. After he says he lays down his life for his sheep, he says, verse 16, "And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd." Well, this seems to be a reference to the fact that Jesus went to the Jews, but the gospel was not just meant for the Jews, right? He goes to the Jews first, then to the Greeks. And so when he's talking to Jewish believers, he says, but guess what? I have other sheep that aren't of this fold. I've got other sheep that belong to me that are somewhere else, but I'm going to bring them in, and there's going to be one great big flock. And so in this sense, Jesus is looking at, I think, now this is my opinion, the worldwide appeal of Christianity, right? It's not just Judaism and Jewish-centered, right? Go to the Jew first, but also then to the Greek. So you've got the gospel message proclaimed first to the Jews, but you've got this other group of sheep that are going to be brought in, and they're going to be one great big happy sheepfold, right? And so in this one line, and we don't always even catch it sometimes, right? We look at the previous line. The Father knows me, I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. Okay, yes, great. The mission of Jesus goes to the crucifixion, right? Willingly. Then in verse 17, for this reason the Father loves me, that because I lay down my life that I may take it back up again. Oh, that's awesome. They didn't force Jesus into this. He did it of his own free will, and that shows his love for his people, right? This is all awesome stuff. But it's kind of like we missed that verse in verse 16, and that tells us that the gospel is for everyone, right? Because you've got gospel going to the Jews, right? This sheepfold, but then you've got the Greeks, and that's a different group. And what that tells us is, to me, it's a very important and timely message for our culture and our society today, because we are seeing people who want to divide humanity by race and by ethnicity or by whatever other cultural markers you want to use. And yet, if you look at the simplicity of the gospel is for every single human being without qualification and without exception. And that's something that should be all bringing us together, right? There are lots of attempts that people make to try to foster unity in the human race, right? And I don't like saying different races because there's really only one human race. I don't like saying there are different ones because that's just yet another way that we are divided from each other, when in reality we're all part of God's creation. We're all His cherished possessions, His cherished creations, and and we should treat each other that way. And little verses like this, and again, this just kind of gets glossed over, in between these great verses of, yeah, I lay down my life for my sheep, I lay down my life and I take it back up again. But don't miss that one verse that says, oh yeah, but guess what? There's all kinds of sheep in all kinds of places, and I'm going to bring them all together, and they're going to be all part of one big, great, wonderful sheepfold, right? One big flock. And that's what really demonstrates the superiority of the gospel, because you can go to other religions and you can see that they value some cultures more than others. They value the home culture very often more than anything else. And so if you practice that religion, you practice it in a way that distinctly resembles the culture that it came from. Well, do you do that with Christianity? No, not really, because Christianity is culturally neutral. And so what is an American or a European or an African or an Asian or an Australian or anyone else, South American, whether you're indigenous person, native person, whether you're a newcomer, an immigrant, what does Christianity look like to you? The same as it does to everyone else. That's the beauty of the gospel, is that it is absolutely universal and timeless in its application. And this is something that gets hinted at when Jesus talks about Him being the great shepherd, because He's not just the shepherd of one type of sheep. He's the great shepherd of sheep of very different kinds that belong to His flock, right? It's a wonderful, wonderful image. So anyway, we'll go ahead and call it a day there. If we're going to see you in worship, we'll be delighted to see you in person. If you're still holding off for now, we hope to see you in the very near future. We miss you guys who haven't been able to participate with us, and we're looking forward to seeing you again. Now, for all the guys who may be watching, don't forget today is Mother's Day. Sometimes for guys it kind of creeps up on you, and you need a little gentle reminder. So make sure you keep that in mind. And for all the ladies, happy Mother's Day. The world would not be the same without you. So we love you guys, and we look forward to seeing you soon.